Hello participants, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's session, which is concluding the final session of the Biodiversity Information from Data and Decisions webinar series. Today we will be looking at improving the value chain of biodiversity data, the obstacles, the gaps and the opportunities. And I just wish to open the session by going through some quick housekeeping slides. So we will be recording the session today to share with participants that have registered for the session. Your microphone will be automatically muted upon you entering the session. But if you have a question, please feel free to use the raise hand function or type your questions into the chat. We recommend your viewing is in the side-by-side mode. You can change that by clicking your view options at the top of your screen. And if you have any technical issues, please feel free to send me a message. My name in the chat is Technical Support Laura Mack, and I will happily help you out where I can. So today's session, we will be using interpretation to enable as wider participation as possible. So we have an interpreter team translating into Portuguese for us. If you wish to use the feature at the bottom toolbar, there is the interpretation icon, which is a little globe. You need to click that and select which language you wish to listen to the session to. And I will now pass over to Kira, who will be chairing today's session.
Thanks very much, Laura. Great to have you all on board. Welcome to all our participants and to our fabulous guest panelists as well. So as Laura mentioned, this is the third of 3 sessions for the interactive webinar series we've hosted called Biodiversity Information from Data to Decisions. We had a number of events already. So we had one last week, which looked at some of the best practices around biodiversity mainstreaming. And then yesterday we brought together a series of intergovernmental ministers working across various sectors in sub-Saharan Africa. And we looked at some of the needs and demands that they have for biodiversity information, as well as some of the challenges they face in accessing it. And we kind of drew on experiences from the Connect project to see how some of those challenges could be overcome. So those recordings will be available very shortly, so do feel free to go back and watch those. I would highly encourage it. And today we'll be really focusing on the data value chain. But before we jump into presentations, I'll just give you a bit of background context to the Connect project. So the Connect project is funded by the Global Environment Facility. It's implemented by the United Nations Environment Programme and executed by UNEP-WCMC. And the core aim of the Connect project is to integrate biodiversity information into national decision-making. So the project has been based in 3 sub-Saharan countries in Ghana, Uganda, and Mozambique. So we've worked with core country teams in those countries, including the Ghana National Biosafety Authority, the government of Mozambique, and Uganda's National Environment Management Authority. So the session today, as I said, will be focusing on the value chain, and I really welcome all of our audience members to post any questions you have into the chat box as the presentations are happening. And we will have a chance to address questions shortly after the presentations have happened. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Abisha, who is going to bring us all up to speed on this concept of the data value chain. So Abisha, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the concept of biodiversity data value chain. But before I do that, I just need to provide a bit of context by looking at some of the key components of the Connect project. Next slide, please. Yeah, key components of the Connect project. As my colleague Kara just said, that the main objective of the Connect project is to ensure that biodiversity is taken into account in decision making across government sectors, by improving development decision makers' access to and use of biodiversity information and embedding biodiversity information within national and sector development processes and decision-making processes. It has got 3 main components that is focusing on, that is trying to address the demand side of biodiversity data and information. That is the first component. And that entails to try to clearly understand the in-country demands for and barriers for using biodiversity and data information within government decision-making processes. The second key component of the Connect project is the supply side of biodiversity data and information. Try to understand where is that data actually is available in order to feed into the demand. And that involves mobilizing and repackaging mainly existing biodiversity data and information from a range of sources, be it national or international, to meet the number of the demands that would have been identified in each of the country. And the third component is really the sustain aspect that connects all these 3 components to really strengthen the connection between government decision makers and biodiversity and ecosystem service data providers to sustainably provide policy relevant and where possible spatially explicit information to meet ongoing national demands. So the philosophy behind that is that every policy or decision-making process should be able to access biodiversity information and use it to consider the implications of a decision on the environment, as well as on people and the economy, which is the ultimate aim of all this work. So these could be decisions around the expansion of agricultural land, or allowing a new fishing practice in coastal areas. So this could be really a wide range of decision-making processes, either at national level or sub-national level. Next slide, please. And so what's needed is to sustain the flow of information, from field data to policy communication. And that's where the biodiversity data and information value chain comes in. I must admit, I always associated value chains with trade and business until I heard the term being used to describe something quite different, and that was the flow of information. That's what I'm going to be talking about. That the flow of information. I'm talking, looking at, from, generating foundational biodiversity data right through to biodiversity knowledge, and actually then using it actually into policy and action. So the term is used to reflect the passing of data between each of the constituent groups of stakeholders in the chain that fund, of course, the data, produce it, supply, rely upon it, interpret, analyze, and use that data and information. And as I've mentioned earlier on, the analogy is similar to supply chains in business, whereby raw materials might be sourced from various producers and suppliers, and there may be multiple levels of processing that, and also distribution along the way until you end up with the final ready for market product. Next slide. So there are several illustrations of the biodiversity data value chain itself that are available. I've decided to go for this one, but I know some other organizations that have been using this approach for quite some time, such as SANBI in South Africa also do have an illustration, and I do have an example of that, I think in my last slide. So it really starts with as I mentioned, gathering of the foundational biodiversity data, for examples on species numbers, distribution of vegetation, or ecosystem types. And it's important to actually emphasize that task may actually take several years. So it requires sort of persistent and detailed work. As you can see from the graph, the first stage under collection, there is, from the chain, the first stage under collection, you do have identification of data, and that's where you need to consult with future users, and also to sort of have an idea of what sort of decision points or entry points that data could be used for. So that is really critical to do at the beginning. And also, of course, determining the level of granularity when collecting the data. And under collection as well, there's the collection aspect of data itself. and that that involves partnering with other producers, or also harnessing new data sources. With the advent of so much technology these days, that's where this really become critical, to partner with organizations that can help with that. And still under collection, there's the processing aspect of data, where we ensure that the data are actually interpretable and also achieve high quality and protected display. Then the next link within the chain is the publication of data itself. So that entails analyzing that data and also releasing that data. I'm just trying to releasing that data, and also disseminating the data. And there are some subcomponents of that part of the chain under analyzation that involve extracting insights from data and visualizing the data in a clear manner. Then the release part of it does involve providing machine-readable data and also data that is accessible either online or offline. Then dissemination, of course, that also involves partnering with intermediaries and also publicizing the data to make it available. The next stage of the chain is uptake, and some of the aspects of that part of the chain, including connecting, which of course is the name of the project that we're working on, incentivizing and also influencing. So under connect, that really involves using technology to connect to users and also processing the data for new insights, depending, of course, on the entry points or policy entry points or decision entry points where the data can be used. That's where that stage is actually important. Then under incentivizing, it entails reducing time cost of data use and also encouraging perception of value. Then influence, that's where we try to promote data user culture and encourage data use for decisions. I've mentioned the idea of sustaining the sustain pillar under the Connect project. I think that's where it's really important that, the whole process, the way it's done is actually iterative in nature, is meant to be actually embedded as a part of the culture in which actual organizations do sort of collect, process and utilize data for decision making, a range of decision making processes or entry points that will arise, either related to policy at national level or sector level, or it could be really private investments. Then there's an element, next stage of the chain is on impact, that focuses mainly on use of the data and the change that it will bring about, and also using that data. Next slide, please. So this is, as I mentioned earlier on, that this is an example of some of the countries that have actually, that are quite advanced in using this concept of the biodiversity value data chain. Like South Africa, the South African Biodiversity Institute, here is a very good example actually, where they've shown how to make the connection between the different links of the chain, from the foundational data through to biodiversity knowledge, and then using it into policy and action. An example here, they've actually taken a basic set of core ingredients like protected area cover, land cover, and habitat condition to produce sort of multiple relevant outputs that support and prioritize protected planning and ecosystem restoration and conservation in South Africa. And as I said, this process is actually being replicated in many countries in Africa as part of the Connect project. Ghana and Uganda are examples of the countries that have actually taken a similar approach. And I think you can clearly see some of the activities under data sources, the analysis and the products that came out of it, and examples of decision support areas or interventions where this data has been used to influence those decision-making processes. So in a nutshell, I think that's a short summary of what the biodiversity data value chain is all about. I think in summary, yeah, I think that's it.
Thanks very much, Abisha, for bringing us all up to speed on the data value chain. And actually, just to inform our audience that in the second half of this session, we will move into an interactive Q&A session where we'll look at each stage of the data value chain. And we'll kind of look at each stage on a case-by-case basis, addressing any opportunities or obstacles that could come up at each of those stages. So we'll have a chance later to dive much deeper into this data value chain. And I'm going to move on now to our next presenter. So I'd like to welcome to the floor Hilary Goodson from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So over to you, Hilary. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Sorry, bear with me whilst I get my screen sorted. Right, so I'm Hilary and I'm the Strategic Partnerships Officer at GBIF and delighted to be here. I'm presenting on data collection and collation, really following on from what Abisha just identified. This presentation firmly looks at identifying that data supply and collection side. So I'm going to talk about data sharing through GBIF and specifically the joint GBIF AFD initiative Data for Nature as an example of how we can broaden this engagement and align commitments to support mainstreaming of biodiversity. Is that slide changing? Yes, right. So firstly, just a recap on what GBIF is and does and how we fit into this. So we were established in 2001 as a collaboration among governments based on a voluntary memorandum of understanding. That followed on a recommendation of the OECD Scientific Working Group, which recognised the potential to bring these vast quantities of scattered data about species into active use for research, conservation, sustainable development. So our role here really is bringing together, and it's about making interoperable biodiversity data from a wide range of diverse sources. And this is really critical to a broadening range of stakeholders and central to these efforts to address biodiversity loss and that association with sustainable development. So addressing this crisis and the related climate agenda requires that raw, credible data and that primary input into the value chain in order to start measuring progress and refining policy. So to date, we operate an international network of 1,700 data sharing institutions in 130 countries. We've mobilised just over 1.8 billion species occurrence records through our gbif.org platform. That's currently growing at about 1 million records per day. Currently, it's being cited at an average of 4 peer-reviewed papers per day as well. So we're now accelerating that pace of work, and again, a diverse list of stakeholders is to the right. But what we're really doing is we're expanding our taxonomic backbone to include metabarcoding, eDNA, machine learning, AI-enabled citizen science, and other automated large-scale data generation and remote sensing. Equally importantly, we're also expanding in terms of our stakeholders, particularly looking at the private sector, including development banks, public banks, financial institutions. We bring all of this together, but for what purpose? And here this demonstrates that value chain. So, there's tracking citations and the onward relevance. We start to build up a picture of how all of those stakeholders sharing standardized and data that is as open as possible are contributing to all of this knowledge that supports better decisions. Some examples here: conservation helps to identify the most important sites for protected areas by underpinning assessments of species extinction through the red listing process, tracking predicted spread of invasive alien species. It's supporting food security by mapping distribution of wild relatives of food crops and looking at location of genetic resources. We're supporting action on climate change through helping to model how these species range will change under different climate change scenarios and the impacts of measures to mitigate that, for example, increased production of biofuels and hydropower. And, you know, very timely, we're supporting human health by distributing, tracking distribution of species that act as vectors, hosts and reservoirs of diseases. So what this means in terms of mainstreaming in that value chain, we have a role to play in the CBD, and we're involved in the upcoming, you know, post-2020 framework. So we contribute through knowledge, through that providing of raw data and that science base. So specifically through Target 19, which is an increase of availability in primary and secondary data. One of the indicators is increase in occurrence records available through GBIF. And, you know, here I'll make the point, which will be touched on, I'm sure, in further presentations. This movement of data is not always linear. There's often processing steps, many in between this raw data used and other products which feed into these indicators, but primary diversity here plays a critical role. So we work closely with a lot of other partners, particularly those around at the table, UNEP-WCMC, GeoBond, and others through the biodiversity indicator partnerships and many other collaborations. So more broadly now touching on the private sector, and so this impact and reporting are increasingly in focus for financial institutions. Many banks, for example, have signed up to the Equator Principles already, committing them to encourage clients to share funded biodiversity data. Moreover, there's clear potential through TNFD framework and other similar instruments to become mandatory, and for central banks, for example, to require institutions under their supervision to assess and report their biodiversity impact. So in light of this, engaging with GBIF offers this dual benefit. It enables this sector to make positive contributions to addressing the biodiversity crisis by coming into that value chain. And that's clearly aligned with the commitments many of them have to be responsible corporate citizens. But secondly, and this is a really interesting area of development, it positions them really favourably to meet future regulatory developments. So this brings me to the Data for Nature initiative, and here I really want to point to the leadership of AFD, and my colleagues from there unfortunately couldn't join us today, but they commissioned a report that looked into the amount of data they were producing and realised that they could play a key role in filling gaps. And so they've put clauses within their contracts to require sharing of data from these projects with GBIF. And we're now bringing in other development banks in the first instance under this initiative as part of the commitment to filling knowledge gaps and building up this consortium for further support. So, you know, and these data gaps can seem a technical matter, but the opposite is true. They're really tangible commitments to collaboration and impact assessments. On average, ecological assessments conducted prior to a development project produces between 500 to 1,000 species occurrence records. You know, these projects are collecting substantial amounts of data, which are often only used in relation to those projects themselves. So there's a reusability aspect here. So AFD, you know, in building up to this Data for Nature initiative, estimated that their community were generating around 300,000 primary biodiversity data items, field observations a year. And many of those are in developing countries whose biodiversity is especially rich, but where evidence and assessments can be more limited. So the amount of additional work and the extra cost involved in data formatting and publication on GBIF.org has also been assessed in an independent study. You know, and our findings are that this involves really moderate additional cost in terms of consultant services, estimated to correspond to less than 0.7% of the average cost of the study. So again, within this data chain and then within our piece of it, there are the processes in terms of how to share data through GBIF, and we're continually developing and updating this guidance, monitoring the publication of raw biodiversity data and its uses in publications, those figures I mentioned earlier, developing training and awareness, but really it's co-development, and we see this as significant impact and light burden. There is that opportunity to add value, to demonstrate leadership by participation in this and helping to address filling those data gaps of poor coverage and contributing to really more robust baselines, which is essential. Not only minimal costs that I mentioned before, but cost savings in terms of reusability, in terms of open science, in terms of that flow on and that opening up to researchers, and easy to implement. So, you know, there are some concerns and responses that we often get because I'm specifically talking to the Data for Nature initiative. I've tabled a few of those again. I'll touch on those. Again, the commercial sensitivity, data publication can be delayed, coordinates can be generalized. There's a host of things that we can work through here. So to that end, I'd really just put up a few links on this last slide. I hope I've given you an overview of both GBIF and where it sits in the data chain, and more specifically some initiatives with some new sectors and bringing that public-private alignment together and mainstreaming. And at this point, I'll hand back over to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hilary. That was fantastic. Really good as well to have that insight into particularly the collecting and storing of data and the data sharing component of the value chain. And it's very clear from your presentation how good steps at those stages really pave the way for the later stages in the value chain. So just reflecting on the points you made in your presentation, and again, I do welcome all of our audience to share any questions you have in the chat, but you spoke a lot about collaboration with other data custodians, other data holders. And I just wondered if you have some thoughts to share around, you know, what are some really core best practices around sharing data between networks of data holders?
That's a great question. I'll pick up on a phrase used in the presentation prior to mine, which is repeatable, harmonized workflows. I really think here it is kind of collaboration on open standards, or as open as possible, and moving more towards that interoperability, which is so critical. And, you know, again, because I was speaking of the private sector, I'll talk again about that alignment that I think we're starting to see more and more, taking that leadership from, you know, particularly the research sector and their position on open science, but transitioning that to open data across all sectors.
Yeah, fantastic. And kind of on a similar line of thinking, I certainly know from my experience of working on several biodiversity mainstreaming projects that to stakeholders who perhaps are not used to working with biodiversity organizations and practitioners, particularly perhaps in the private sector or elsewhere, stakeholders don't always see that immediate benefit of collaborating around the sharing of this data. So I would love to hear kind of what approach you take to securing buy-in and involvement from stakeholders as part of your work. Actually,
that's a great question, and it's one of the trickiest. You know, we saw it is, I mean, it's really a long value chain, and we, you know, particularly those of us around this table that are very familiar with this world understand our relation to each other. But I think that message and that demonstration is still something that we need to work hard on explaining. You know, again, these things it often takes years to be able to go from, say, an upload of the data set to being able to see where that is used in a report or a finding or translated into policy. You know, I think one of the things that I've seen more and more of, and this summit is a really good example of it, is just that collaboration amongst those known players that are part of that value chain, and really strengthening that. It's really heartening to see things like the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership not calling out a single organisation, but calling out all of those actors to what we do collectively.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks very much. And you may have just touched on this in your response there, but we've had a question come in from Nadine. Nadine wants to know, what is your experience with challenges around data sharing between private sector and governments? Which I think is a very interesting question, because this brings up this clash in interests as well quite often. You know, different actors will have their own aims and their own interests. And what has been your experience of facilitating data sharing between governments and private sector?
I'm going to speak really specifically to the GBIF experience here, because I think it's interesting. I don't know how illuminating it will be. For me, I'm really conscious of that because we are an IGO, so we are predominantly core funded by governments, and obviously there is a cost in terms of enabling regional publishing, expanding that network to kind of more participants, where we have to be really, it's a really fine line that we're starting to unpack now in terms of how much we bring this sector along, because it's been demonstrated to be so valuable, and how much our returns need to kind of be governed by those governmental funders. So again, I think it's something that we're starting to navigate, but I think that build up, it's something that we need to put a lot of thought into demonstrating that kind of collectively the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But it's not something I can specifically give a single answer to at this moment, other than to acknowledge that is a very good question and one we're intimately aware of.
Absolutely. Well, it's certainly something that we can continue to ponder on throughout this session, I'm sure. So thanks very much, Hilary, for talking about particularly the kind of starting elements of the data value chain. And I'm going to introduce Sylvain now, Sylvain Rolls from UNEP-WCMC, who will be talking much more about the kind of later stages of the data value chain. So using data and communicating data to decision makers. So Sylvain, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just double check if everyone is currently seeing my screen?
Certainly are, thank you.
Superb. All right, thank you. So yes, moving down along the data supply chain, I'm now going to talk about spatial data and environmental sensitivity mapping. But just going back to who needs biodiversity data, and as has been highlighted across the different presentations already, there are a variety of stakeholders and actors in need of environmental spatial data for many different purposes. You have national governments, as well as IGOs and NGOs, corporate sector, and researchers. What I will focus on specifically are the applications for area-based planning, which is a proactive approach to balancing conservation and sustainable development opportunities through the development of a spatial plan. And that is often led by national governments, but potentially as well by the corporate sector, and very much rely on the information and the expertise of IGOs and NGOs and researchers. So bringing about all those four key stakeholders in the biodiversity data realm. And of course, that's why spatial data plays a fundamental role. Mapping is a critical tool in cross-sectoral or sector-based planning, helping us to spatially define activities a country wants to occur within its national boundaries. And there are often many different competing social, cultural, economic, and ecological priorities that can be difficult to untangle without a spatial overview. And mapping is one step in this process to enable decisions, which is why I wanted to remind the role of spatial data in terms of identifying national or local specific features, the help it can provide in terms of monitoring and evaluating a particular habitat, enabling analysis, and really evaluating the benefits and the trade-off in such decision-making processes. The role of spatial data and mapping efforts are key components of the Oil for Development programme funded by Norway. And through this Oil for Development or OFD programme, the Norwegian Environment Agency and UNEP-WCMC are looking to build capacities in partner countries and strengthen the availability, use and management of biodiversity data for the environmental management of the oil and gas sector. We currently have activities ongoing in Ghana, Lebanon, Mozambique, Somalia and Uganda. And so of course there is a great overlap with the Connect project in Ghana, Uganda and Mozambique. And we've always worked very closely with them in terms of making the most of the synergies between the OFD programme and Connect because we touch upon so many common topics. One area of work that NEA and UNEP-WCMC have been exploring extensively is environmental sensitivity mapping. Environmental sensitivity relates to areas at risk of being negatively impacted as a result of an activity or an event. This sensitivity can be mapped out into a sensitivity atlas, which can act as an interactive tool for decision makers to understand which areas are sensitive to external pressures. And there are varying definitions of sensitivity and vulnerability, but for the sake of our context and this presentation, we define sensitivity as a combination of the susceptibility of an environmental feature or an environmental asset, that could be a mangrove forest or coral reef, so the susceptibility of that particular asset to a pressure, as well as that environmental asset's importance. And that importance can be defined based on extensive stakeholder consultation. So if you look at the diagram on the left here, you have susceptibility and importance leading to an asset's sensitivity. And if you add the exposure element, whether or not that asset is being exposed to the pressure of interest, you will understand its vulnerability to that pressure. And historically, environmental sensitivity mapping has been widely used for emergency response planning, in particular for oil spill contingency planning. However, it can be applied for project level planning or monitoring as well, and for strategic level planning for development in general, including any sorts of infrastructure beyond just oil and gas. And it can even be applied in conservation management, which is what we are currently trialing in Uganda, for example. But an environmental sensitivity atlas as a decision-making tool relies heavily on spatial data. And availability of spatial data is, of course, a challenge faced by many of the OFD partner countries that we are working with, as well as many other countries. And this is why NEA and UNEP-WCMC have developed a sensitivity mapping tool that was published in 2020, which would facilitate the application of sensitivity mapping in a variety of contexts and has the relevant flexibility for integration into national planning processes. So MESA, Mapping Environmentally Sensitive Assets, is a step-by-step methodology and GIS processing tool for producing sensitivity atlases for a range of user needs. It provides a standardized approach capable of addressing multiple pressures and datasets with limited capacity, including in GIS, required so as to implement. And this means that new data can easily be integrated as they become available, hence ensuring regular updates of the sensitivity atlas and its improvement with time as more data are collected. So we're finding that a lot of our partners might have limited data to start with, but in the future, as they collect more data sets, because of the flexibility of MESA, they're able to update the atlas on a regular basis. How MESA work in a nutshell is that as you can see on the right here, sensitivity rankings from very low to very high sensitivity are assigned to different environmental assets, which are represented by those polygons. That value is then attributed to the grid cells of the atlas that overlap with those assets. And that gives you landscape level view of where sensitivity is highest to a particular pressure. MESA is a publicly available tool that runs in FME, which does require a license, as well as in QGIS. And it can be downloaded from UNEP-WCMC's website, and I'll have a link just at the end of the presentation. But first, let's look at how this has been applied in practice with one of our partner countries, which is Ghana. So Ghana's Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was looking to update its 2004 Coastal Oil Spill Sensitivity Atlas to account for changes in the distribution of both its ecological and socioeconomic assets and highlight their sensitivity to oil spills, which can originate from both shipping as well as offshore extraction activities within the Ghana coastal waters. Additional data collection was first required, and that was carried out by EPA through the Environmental Information Network in Ghana to access data from other agencies and other ministries, as well as through the generation of new data sets using remote sensing that was carried out by UNEP-WCMC, including to have an updated distribution of the coastal lagoons. The sensitivity rankings of each environmental assets, that includes both the ecological and socioeconomic features, were agreed upon based on stakeholder consultation, and again, using the Environmental Information Network and discussing with other ministries and agencies, using as well the information from the original 2004 Atlas, as well as the national legislation. And all this information was then compiled and run through the MESA tool to produce sensitivity maps as the one displayed here for all 539 kilometers of the coastline. Those maps will be made available in a variety of formats to accommodate for the different needs of users. And in particular, the final data files allow for each grid cell to be interrogated as to its sensitivity value and what assets are triggering that particular sensitivity value. So you can see an example on the bottom right here. For example, that particular grid cell has a sensitivity ranking of 20 due to the presence of mangrove, which would trigger a very high sensitivity level. And so the key messages that I really wanted to highlight here were that there is great potential for area-based planning to balance out development and conservation objectives. And with environmental sensitivity mapping, that allows a better understanding of the sensitivity of a landscape to a variety of pressures, therefore supporting better decision-making. The sensitivity atlases are only as good as the information or the spatial data inputted, hence the need for availability and maintenance of key data sets. Finally, just a reminder that MESA is publicly available. It provides a flexible approach to sensitivity mapping that can be applied beyond just the oil and gas sector, but in general in terms of development and infrastructure. And you have the link here for you if you want to check. And I've also included on this slide a picture from a training workshop that we ran with our different OFD partner countries in 2019 in Arusha, back when in-country meetings were possible, and which I know we all hope to very soon resume. But in the meantime, we have continued working with all our different OFD partner countries in a remote capacity and are using environmental sensitivity mapping and other area-based planning tools to help them develop their different industries in alignment with their biodiversity conservation goals at large. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to answer to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. Another fantastic kind of illustrative example of how data goes from the very local level right up, right up that chain to being used in decision making. So thanks very much for that. And we have had a question come in from someone in the audience. It's phrased in two parts, so I'll be kind to you and give you the first half and then move on to the second half of the question. So thanks, John, for your question. John would like to know, could you expand a bit on how you bridged the gap in the value chain? So how you identified available data that could be freely used to transform into the sensitivity maps?
Yes, so there I mentioned, for example, in the context of Ghana, there was a lot of work to be done through the Environmental Information Network. So it certainly helps when in a country you already have an established platform where biodiversity or environmental information is being shared. And so there will be an understanding of what is currently available, and they might have already identified gaps as well. Obviously, we also always look at global data sets. We have the advantage of being within UNEP-WCMC, which is housing many key global data sets on biodiversity, such as the World Database on Protected Areas. And so we are certainly making use of those data sets whenever we engage with national or local partners, because they can help complement the information available on the ground. Ultimately, we also look to engage with other organizations that might be present in the country, and that includes NGOs that could be carrying out data collation, especially in the field, that could complement any data sets that governments are housing. So it is very much a treasure hunting game in terms of engaging it with as many partners as possible to understand who has what data. And it is through that process that we often identify potential data gaps, and that we realize we do not have any up-to-date data on coastal lagoons, for example. And that's where we would look to fill some of those gaps with, for example, remote sensing, acknowledging that obviously that has impacts on the resolution, on the reliability of the data sets that we're using. And so we always look to use the best available data sets at the time. But it's also why we want a tool that can be updated on a regular basis, because maybe in 5 years' time, we will have access to data that has been collated on the field, that has been ground truth, and therefore would be better for the purpose of a sensitivity atlas.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Sylvain. And I'm noticing a kind of common theme running through the session already about the importance of data not only kind of meeting the demands of the end users, but it has to be kind of context relevant as well to, you know, what questions different users are trying to identify. And also it has to be adaptable. So, you know, change is occurring constantly at the kind of ground level, at the government level, and these analyses really need to respond to those changes as well. So interesting to see that kind of recurring thread throughout. And I'll move on now to the second half of John's question, which is, how do you navigate acceptability of national versus global data for decisions by sovereign states?
Yes, so our first starting point would always be the national level data that has been collated, especially because of the nature of our partners, which will often be governmental agencies. And so if they have in-house data platforms that they are using, that would be our first source of information. And then only we would look to complement with global data sets. We acknowledge shortcomings associated with global data sets that might not reflect the local specificities. And for us, it is very important that those local specificities are reflected in any sensitivity atlases, because obviously that will impact how important certain environmental assets are perceived by local communities or in the national legislation, and this should take precedence over certain global goals, because ultimately those local communities and those agencies will be the one using the sensitivity atlas, and so we want to make sure it is fit for their purpose. The global level information and understanding and data are there to support that that input and that decision making in the national context. So we do look as much as possible to use national level data sets and to fill gaps with global data sets.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. And I know you did touch on this a little bit at the end of your presentation, but I'd really like to kind of draw out this particular message, which is, what do you think are the main benefits and motivations for government sectors to use tools like the sensitivity mapping?
One of the key reasons why we wanted to make sensitivity mapping applied beyond just the oil and gas sector is because it is a tool to understand a landscape and the conflicting pressures on the landscape to support better decision making. And that obviously is not just the case in the development of the oil and gas industry. It is the case in the development of any industry that is going to have infrastructure that might be competing with environmentally sensitive assets. And so having that ability to understand spatially where are the areas that you should be looking at, that should potentially be no-go zones, or that warrant additional mitigation measures, are really important as early on as possible in any planning processes to enable a country to really develop their industries in a sustainable fashion. And so, for example, we've seen many instances of EIA legislation making reference to sensitivity as a concept and to encouraging environmental impact assessments to include the consideration of sensitivity of environmental features. But then ultimately, when it is being implemented, that sensitivity only reflects the importance, for example, of protected areas. It doesn't look at having a spatial analysis of where they are located in relation to the project design or the project route or location, and how this could be best located to minimize impact on those protected areas, or also trying to prioritize in terms of sensitivity. If a protected area is realistically less susceptible to a certain type of pressure than another one, then that could warrant making sure that that second protected area that is very highly susceptible has additional mitigation measures to protect it against that imminent pressure. And so having a better understanding of how sensitivity is spread across a particular landscape can facilitate taking difficult decisions to balance out development and conservation. And that is not, again, just a case for the oil and gas industry. That is applicable across any industries, which is why we want MESA to be used across.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sylvain. And we have had some more questions come in. I think this is very much related to what you were just talking about. So I'll quickly address Frank's question. And I hope I've understood this correctly, but Frank, do feel free to correct me. He wants to know, what other applications do you see for the sensitivity mapping? So I'm wondering if this means outside of government decision-making, perhaps?
Yes, so I've just mentioned here in the context of infrastructure development and EIA application, but we've also been looking at using sensitivity mapping for conservation planning and management, which is what we're doing in Uganda. So at the level of a national park, Simuliki National Park, which is just south of the Lake Albertine, we're looking at how different pressures such as community resource use or flooding is impacting the different features within the national park, therefore would warrant additional management or conservation action from the agencies managing the park itself. So we can choose the scale at which we want to apply sensitivity mapping, and we can use it for conservation purposes. Beyond just the Oil for Development program, we're also using MESA in UNEP-WCMC to look at the future impacts of climate change on seagrass distribution in the Mediterranean region. And so again, it is a tool to allow the understanding of how different features react to pressures across the landscape. And so that can be used by governments as well as by NGOs, or really even any interested stakeholders, including the corporate sector. Companies could use sensitivity mapping to understand where best to look into new developments, new potential sites.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And we have a question also from George. Thanks for your question, George. He would like to know, have you ever encountered a situation where there is conflict between national acceptability of data by different countries? And great, George, that you're kind of bringing challenges to the fore, because that is something we do really want to dive into in this session. So thanks.
Yeah, and I think that probably does relate to a question that was addressed to Hilary earlier in terms of how do you facilitate data sharing between different partners, including between the corporate sector and government, and how to create this global acceptance of data by all the different partners. And I think one thing that we have certainly found, in addition to the open standards that Hilary mentioned is the QA/QC element in terms of having that quality assurance behind data sets. And that quality assurance can be provided by governments if they so desire to check any data sets provided to them by other organizations or by the corporate sector before including them on their platform. But they can also make use of international partners, including, for example, GBIF or ourselves, because we are experienced working with data means that we can ensure that sufficient metadata, for example, information about data sets is being provided with any data sets that would give it reliability and reassurance in terms of we know where it comes from, we know who we can talk to in terms of understanding it better, when it has been collected, by whom and where, and having all that information in the background really helps creating trust towards data sets, including for governments and standards in general, either the Darwin Core standards from GBIF or the World Database on Protected Areas, WDPA standards, UNEP-WCMC, are very good tool for us when we engage with governments to create best practices in terms of keeping a record of all that information, because that will be needed in the later parts in terms of, again, creating that trust for data sets. And there is a constant engagement process with data providers to ensure data is up to date. That is work that has been carried out by colleagues, including in UNEP-WCMC. And when it comes to collating information for the World Database on Protected Areas, there is certainly a lot of back and forth with data providers to ensure that the information they provided is the latest to date, and therefore global data sets represent the most up-to-date information and is approved by nationals, by each country individually.
Wonderful. I think that's a really good point actually to really stress here, is that, you know, this is such an ongoing process, and it's not just that the data is inputted to the systems on a one-off basis. They need to be constantly revisited and updated, and I'm sure, you know, you guys really have your work cut out, you know, chasing up and following up with various data providers to make sure that it's still the most current data available. So yeah, thanks very much to both Hilary and Sylvain for your wonderful presentations. John has just slipped in a last minute question, which I will just address before we move on. So to either of our speakers, the question is there a minimum viable product? And i.e., should we not let the perfect get in the way of the good? Okay, thanks, John, for clarifying.
That does help. I think on our side, certainly, that we always have a minimum set of standards that we expect for data sets before being willing to use them. And then there is the ideal set of standards. If we can get that extra information, that would be great. But we will get started with the indeed minimal viable level of information. And again, to repeat myself, almost MESA is meant to be used with as little information as you have, and then you can add to it as you go ahead, because indeed you should not let the perfect stand in the way. Any information already gives you a better understanding of the landscape, and you should make use of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Sylvain said there, and certainly on the data quality aspect, you know, that is a concern, and we are looking, you know, constantly looking within our work program to build more. I mean, there's transparency already, but more assurance, I suppose, and to bring the community on and to make sure that that work of curation is as distributed and wide as open as possible. But you know, I think you summed it up perfectly in terms of the perfect is the enemy of the it gets in the way of the good. I you know, certainly for us, we would not really work towards a minimum viable product. I would make the distinction though, that reliability and quality control of the data is yeah, an ongoing and more critical, particularly as we see this growth, which is a contribution both of the political agenda of the time and the growth in infrastructure and data kind of capability and processing.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And I think we've already touched on a number of really interesting and important opportunities, but also challenges in the data value chain. And in the second half of the session, that is something that we're going to dive into in much more detail. So I'm just going to welcome everybody to take a quick 5-minute break. And I'd ask that, go away, make a cup of tea and rejoin us in 5 minutes. That would be wonderful. We'll move into the interactive session. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Just give it another moment or so to allow everyone to get back. My kettle definitely doesn't boil that fast, and I'm sure other people have the same issue. All right, and while we're waiting, I'm just going to pull up the screen for the next part of the session. All right, so I'm going to jump straight back in now. So for those of you who are not familiar with Miro, it's basically an online app, kind of like an interactive whiteboard. So we can add notes and messages to the whiteboard as we go through this session. Laura is going to keep an eye on the chat for me to just flag up any questions or comments that come in. But allow me to run you through what we have here on the screen. So this is the complete value chain of biodiversity data, a very simplified version, I should add, because there are a lot of smaller points that happen along the way, as you've all learned throughout the session. So we begin with collecting data as the first step, and then, of course, the all-important storing of data. We've got the analysis of the data, communicating biodiversity information to decision makers. And of course, the reason why we do any of this is so that the biodiversity information can be used for national decision making. So underneath each of these stages, we've added a number of the obstacles and gaps that could emerge at each of the steps, as well as the opportunities. So for anybody in the audience who has faced challenges of their own or opportunities that they would like to add to this whiteboard, then I welcome you to share them in the chat or raise your hand and we can add them on there and address them. And the idea here really is to make our way through this whiteboard, kind of addressing some of the key obstacle, gaps and opportunities that resonate with our panelists. So I welcome any of our panelists really to reflect on some of the points as we move along the value chain and kind of draw on your own experiences, or indeed add any additional obstacles, gaps or opportunities to the whiteboard. So let me zoom in a little bit more. And I think we'll begin with some of the obstacles and gaps that take place at the collecting data stage. So some of the points that we have here already is that data is often dispersed among a broad range of data custodians or data holders. And that's certainly something that's already cropped up so far in the presentations, is that it can be a real expedition to get hold of that data from all the various data holders. We've also got, perhaps in some contexts, these all-important collaborative relationships between different data custodians can be quite weak, or that indeed there are gaps in the available data, which is very often the case and something, again, that has cropped up so far. So I'll move straight down as well to the opportunities here, because one of the clear opportunities with noticing these gaps in the data is that this is a chance to then fill those data gaps. And it's also a chance to strengthen national networks or global networks between data custodians. So I can see already that Laura is adding some additional points here, including mistrust of data holders is a really interesting challenge that's been brought up. And I'd like to open the floor now to any of our panelists to either add points of their own or comment on some of these that they have encountered in their own work. So please.
I think perhaps if I just jump in, so obviously a lot of those challenges here relate to existing data. And obviously once gaps in the available data have been established, there is often a desire to collect new data, but that's where one of the key challenges that come up for us is often lack of resources, lack of time, and the inability to have staff go in the field to collate new data sets, to carry out extensive field surveys would allow a better data sets in general. And that is very much a big obstacle that would lead us as a result to look into global data sets or remote sensing because the field work itself is not feasible.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. Certainly from my experience of working on biodiversity mainstreaming projects, that is an issue, and capacity building then does become a kind of, core aim to make this process easier and replicable in the future. So I can see other labels are being added here by my colleagues. So some of the other points that are coming up already are, so yeah, data being collected in different formats. I think that's a really interesting point. Data doesn't always come in consistent forms, even in some contexts where you're collecting knowledge from Indigenous peoples or local communities. Some of that data may be even orally communicated. So I think that is a really interesting point, that it doesn't always come in a consistent format. We also have gaps in capacity across geographic and thematic areas. Did I say capacity? Yeah, no, gaps in capacity across geographic and thematic areas, exactly. So I think, again, that kind of resonates with what we were talking about a moment ago as well. Hilary, would you like to kind of reflect, are there any stickers on the obstacles and gaps section of collecting data that really resonate with you, and any kind of solutions you've found to overcoming some of them?
Thanks. I've actually contributed in the chat to some of those stickers, but and again, I think they're touching on that, as well as the gaps in capacity. Somebody else wrote about data holders expecting the agency to request the data to pay. I think payment for filling that capacity and contribution is still a huge issue in terms of how we mobilize those resources, and how we spread that out to level up and fill some of those gaps, which needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. And I'd be interested to hear, actually, do you have to kind of really work hard to stress non-monetary incentives for providing this data? So kind of really communicating to data holders how this will contribute to the greater good and that kind of thing? Yeah,
hugely. It's, yeah, absolutely. And certainly there are a couple of issues, digital sequencing is for one, where that there are monetary restrictions or restrictions on kind of the openness of things, and for very good reason. But by and large, open data is something that we are kind of continually stressing and continually spearheading.
Yeah, fantastic. And of course, we also have Abisha on the line, who has been heavily involved in the Connect project. So Abisha, if you want to come in on any of these points, then do just jump in. Okay, so I'm going to move as well now to the opportunities. Oh, sorry, Abisha, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can just mention that we also, as part of Connect, did a review of existing GEF projects to look at some of the key barriers in terms of using biodiversity data and information. And actually, the top rending issue was the availability of data, which was actually 97% of the project that we reviewed, followed by accessibility to data, capability to use it, and also willingness to use data. Thought I should mention that as well.
Yeah, that's a great one. And actually something I've encountered before, which I am going to add here, particularly around kind of academic papers and material, you know, language barrier can sometimes be quite a big issue as well, you know, having to translate entire papers into another language can be very time consuming and challenging. So I'm certainly going to add that one there too. All right. And let's move on to the opportunities now also. And this, of course, is not an exhaustive list of the opportunities. So please do feel free to really highlight to me some of the additional opportunities at this data collection stage. So to refresh, we've got a chance to strengthen collaborations between data custodians, which from the sounds of things, everybody's been working extremely hard towards in their projects. And also a chance to identify and address gaps. And I think ultimately successes at this stage really kind of pave the way for success at the later stages as well. So I'm certainly going to add that one in there.
Yeah, and just kind of extending on the chance to identify and address gaps, it's also about the chance to identify research prioritization, and I think that is a really important one.
Yeah, that's a great one. I can see that being added on there. Yeah, I think you're right. You know, I think this is being pulled into question more and more as, you know, there is so much research taking place all the time, but with so many of the challenges we're facing globally in relation to, you know, huge kind of ecological change and climate change and things like that, we do need to be a little bit more pragmatic about the research we're doing to really address gaps in our current knowledge. So I think, yeah, that's a fantastic point to add there. Wonderful. And if anyone else has any more points, otherwise I'll move on to the next stage of the value chain. All right, so storing data. Now, from what I understand, this is a very kind of technical aspect of the data value chain, requires, you know, attention to detail and rigor. So some of the obstacles and gaps that we've identified at this stage are something that crops up a lot, and particularly in some developing countries, is that there is sometimes a lack of a good centralized system for storing data. So, you know, the data may be out there, but how do stakeholders and practitioners access that data from one reliable source? So that nicely leads on to the point about not all stakeholders having access to the data. And also this challenge around identifying which data is reliable. And that has come up as a challenge already during the webinar. I see a point's just been added here that storing data is not cheap. Yeah, that's a definitely worth addressing here, I think. And I welcome any of our panelists to kind of add any key obstacles and gaps that you often encounter at this data storage part of the value chain.
If I can just jump in, I think one that's been quite interesting in the All for Development program is that depending on the governmental agency we work with, we, for example, might be exposed to data platforms for the purpose of storing environmental impact assessment EIA data. But maybe if we are working with another environmental agency, they could have a separate data platform dedicated to data collated for biodiversity conservation purposes or through research projects, in partnership with universities or with conservation organization. And obviously those different data sources are complementary. Ultimately, they are giving a better understanding of your national level biodiversity, but they might be in completely separate entities. And as has already been highlighted here, is not all technical stakeholders could have access to both platforms, and that there could be a gap as a result in terms of accessing one's data, even within a governmental body in itself. And so the intent behind any specific data platform needs to be very clear and will often decide its access and its users. And that could be an accidental challenge if it does restrict access to certain users because of the sensitivity of the information, the need for confidentiality that is sometimes associated with certain data sets.
Okay, interesting. So in a way, when you are kind of planning any kind of biodiversity mainstreaming project, a really important consideration is kind of planning who will have access and any kind of, you know, security measures that need to be put in place around data sharing and who is allowed to share the data and at what time and for what purposes. So yeah, really interesting that you draw attention to that. Thanks very much. I see another interesting point here in relation to the lack of a good centralized system for storing data. Sometimes those systems have been developed in a top-down manner and without the people who will actually be using that data, their own needs haven't been considered in that process. And I think that's a really interesting one. It totally relates back to what we've said earlier about how this data is all very well and good, but it really does need to serve the needs of its users. And I've certainly seen some kind of complex data storage solutions in the past, and it can, again, kind of drain time and resources understanding how that storage system works. So certainly involving the stakeholders at the beginning will really make that process go smoother. All right, do we have any more points for this one? Otherwise, we'll look at some of the opportunities at this stage. All right, so oh, someone's just added a sneaky one at the last minute. Okay, so some agencies allow individuals to hold onto the data on their laptops. And of course, when they leave the organization, the data goes with them. I think I'm actually surprised we didn't bring that one up already, because I think that is such a crucial point, you know, in terms of really improving the longevity of the biodiversity mainstreaming process. How is that going to be possible if data is kind of disappearing as, you know, changes in where people are working is also changing? So thanks for that point to whichever mysterious person just added that to the board. That's great. Okay, so our main opportunities here. It's a chance to strengthen systems for centralized data storage, and clearly an important consideration here is to make sure that storage system meets the needs of the users who will be accessing that data. It will also improve access to data for practitioners and other stakeholders. This is kind of a point that is consistent throughout. Ultimately, the end game is to improve access to the data. And we also have here streamlining data based on its credibility. So this is kind of, I suppose, in relation to a point that Sylvain was making about kind of the quality assurance processes when you are storing data, but also being mindful that some data is certainly better than no data. So it's about finding that balance between using what we have, but also making sure that there is some kind of standard that we're adhering to. Wonderful, thanks. I wonder if any more questions or comments have come in through the chat. And I do, again, I welcome any of the audience members. You are more than welcome to add points of your own to the whiteboard from your own experiences. All right. So I think now we'll move on to the next stage of the value chain. Analyzing data. Now this, again, quite a technical one, certainly not my area of expertise, but I'd love to pad out the kind of obstacles and gaps around this. At the moment, we've got data analysis requires strong technical abilities, absolutely. And I think that's often a core area where teams who are doing a biodiversity mainstreaming project need capacity development. And that links really nicely to gaps in national capacity for analysing data. So I wonder if anyone on our panel would like to come in with any challenges that they've encountered from their own projects, or any experience they'd like to reflect on, or methods for overcoming these challenges.
think the one I would reflect on is always going to be related to this. If there is a need of strong technical abilities and there might be limited capacity, limited number of individuals able to carry out this spatial analysis, for example, that likely means they are in very high demand in their own organization. And so obviously they will have limited time available to dedicate to each project. And there is a need for retaining those particular individuals. We were talking earlier about people living with their laptops with the data on it. Those same people could be the ones that had the in-house knowledge on how to run a particular analysis on that data. And it goes with them once they leave the organization. And so that retention is absolutely key unless there is sufficient capacity building with other individuals across the organization.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Sylvain. And I still can't believe we didn't address that one, because it's such an important point around the obstacles and gaps at that stage. And someone else has added that the necessary infrastructure and hardware/software. Yeah, absolutely. There are so many kind of data analysis programs out there. And I don't know, I'm sure many of you in the audience have experience of using platforms like GIS. And they're constantly being updated, and they're very temperamental softwares quite often. And I know that is a big kind of time and resource challenge for a lot of people anywhere. Okay, someone's also added quality control checks. Yeah, I think that's, again, you know, analysis can so often go wrong. It's something that needs to kind of be quality checked a lot. Skills to translate policy questions into technical queries. That's a really interesting one. You know, it comes back to understanding what the demand is at the national level for different types of biodiversity information. And of course, in order to address that question, you have to know exactly what kind of analysis you can run to be able to, you know, really pinpoint key messages that will answer that question. So that's a great one there. I'm going to move down to opportunities at the analysis stage. Okay, so the most obvious one, of course, is to uncover important information about biodiversity status and trends to ultimately inform national decision-making. And when practitioners build that capacity to be able to run these analysis, and that data is continually being updated and added to, the idea is that you should be able to replicate analysis in the future to be able to keep the information current. So that is a really key opportunity at the analysis stage and throughout, really. And of course, we've got improving national capacity for analysing data. And actually, I'd like to bring in my colleague Abisha here, who would ideally give us a bit of an overview, because we have a lot of experience, of course, of this on the Connect project. And our colleagues in Ghana, Uganda and Mozambique have been creating biodiversity information products of their own and running different types of analysis. So I wonder, Abisha, if you'd be happy to come in here and kind of give a bit of an explanation about those biodiversity information products and the benefits of them.
Yeah, thanks, Kira. Yes, I can say something about that. So the countries actually that use this part of the Connect, that use the spatial biodiversity assessment approach, it mainly Ghana and Uganda, and I think we touched on that yesterday. And I think for both the countries, I think it was pretty much their kind of first comprehensive national spatial assessment of the state of biodiversity, especially, for example, for Ghana, covering mainly terrestrial and aquatic environments. And on the basis of that assessment, they actually managed to sort of develop two new headline indicators for assessing the state of, in the case of Ghana, the state of biodiversity in Ghana, focusing on ecosystem threat status and ecosystem protection level. And the primary purpose, of course, of that assessment and focusing on developing these two indicators is to provide sort of a high-level summary of the state of biodiversity in both the two countries. The main intention, of course, was targeting that to decision makers both inside and outside the biodiversity sector. For example, in Ghana, as I mentioned to those who participated in yesterday's event, that they've also, in addition to targeting agriculture as the sector that they would influence using the spatial biodiversity assessment products, they've also used the BIPs, what I call biodiversity information products, to inform their planning for their petroleum hub in some parts of Ghana, I think, and also in marine spatial planning, I think in 4 regions in the western part of the country. Uganda have also used a similar assessment, focusing on the policy entry point which they chose for the Connect project, which is agriculture. So what they've actually done in Uganda, the assessment focused on themes related to ecosystem classification, pressures on biodiversity, protected areas, the threat status, protection level of ecosystems. And on that basis, they've actually conducted an initial analysis of a priority biodiversity hotspots to avoid when planning, which areas, are suitable for agriculture and which sort of, areas are important for biodiversity or environmental sensitive area that agricultural expansion should avoid. I think in summary, those are the main things actually that they did using spatial biodiversity assessments.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know Connect has obviously been a prime opportunity for them to undergo training with our partner organizations and with their in-country experts as well. So that is still very much in development there, and the training is ongoing. But yeah, certainly a great opportunity once you know what the demand is for information to really pinpoint where you can build your capacity to be able to answer that information. Thanks, Abisha, that was great. All right, so zooming back out, we're going to move on to the communicating biodiversity information to decision makers. And I think it's important to say that certainly none of the steps in the data value chain are easy, but I think when you're an expert in GIS, that's a whole different thing to be able to being able to really kind of gain buy-in from government decision makers. There's no kind of formula for getting it right, that's for certain. And it's often a challenge that just requires constant effort and constant input, particularly when, decision makers are often changing, national policies and circumstances are always changing. So this really is a kind of challenging stage of the data value chain. So let's see what obstacles and gaps we've got under here. Okay, so sometimes biodiversity practitioners can lack experience in giving clear information about biodiversity to decision makers. And that kind of goes back to what I was just saying, it's all good if you are super experienced and really accomplished in data analysis, but it's not always a given that you'll also receive training in how to really communicate that information effectively. But it's such an important element of the data value chain that really requires attention and effort. And again, it's not always clear which decision makers could have the most influence. And I'll speak to this in a second from the Connect perspective. We've used a really fantastic tool to kind of address this challenge. Engaging government ministers can be challenging. Of course, this is something that's come up several times already. Each sector will have its own kind of aims and goals that it's intending to meet. And quite often that comes into conflict with biodiversity considerations. So it's about finding ways to incentivize the use of biodiversity information, not just because that's what our kind of core goal is within the biodiversity sector, but also because quite often we have mutual aims with the development sector, and biodiversity information plays a really integral role in meeting those mutual aims. Okay, we've also got decision makers lack reliable information about biodiversity. I think actually that belongs more on the opportunity section, but certainly an obstacle, if decision makers are not used to having access to good biodiversity information, it may seem like quite a strange concept to suddenly introduce it into decision-making processes. And this is a super important one here, that information may be too technical for the end users. And I think striking the balance well between giving them the information they need to really hit home the message about information relating to biodiversity, balancing that with making sure it's accessible and understandable, perhaps through the use of graphs, tables, and kind of key messages. Finding that balance can be really tricky. And I think a lot of people working in biodiversity mainstreaming have faced that challenge and had to overcome it several times. So if any of our panelists would like to come in and reflect on any of the points in the obstacles and gaps section here, I welcome you to do so.
Perhaps just on the formats that you've just mentioned, in terms of, is it a case of using graphs, using tables? Certainly in terms of even just environmental sensitivity mapping, we found that the end product will vary depending on the audience you will be addressing. And so a PDF map might be completely sufficient if you're looking to non-technical users who you want to understand the landscape and the general area, whereas you would keep the spatial data files in, for example, a GIS software for technical users who will be able to interrogate the data further, but there very much needs to be multiple formats that can be adapted to your audience, because you will want to put across certain messages to different audiences.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Sylvain. And we've had another one added just now as well. Decision makers are not interested, though they may be well informed. And I think this is really kind of a challenge that runs throughout, and that's where so much of the effort and input is required to stress to stakeholders and government members what the value is of using biodiversity information in decision making. Please, Abisha.
Yeah, and if I can also just add to that, I think these points that you have been raised are really important, especially the issue around data and its analysis. In most cases, actually, based on my experience working with Connect and other mainstreaming projects, is that it's nearly impenetrable for non-experts. And sometimes as well, the way it can be presented is not exactly gripping, especially for decision makers. So it's really incumbent upon the team that is involved to make sure that there's right expertise within the team to help with that, so that the target ministry or sector at least can get the whole sort of story in a simple way. I think that's critical.
Yeah, I think you're so right. And again, actually, I'd love to draw here on the Connect experience, because a point here saying that it's not always clear which decision makers could have the most influence. And in the interest of really highlighting some of the tools available for addressing some of these challenges, a key component of the Connect project was to conduct a political economy analysis in each of the countries where the project was taking place. And it's really an exercise that kind of encourages you to challenge your assumptions about which decision makers might have the most influence. It's an opportunity to really kind of reassess the political landscape through a series of interrogative questions and mapping exercises, and to really pinpoint good points for intervention where information about biodiversity could be really pivotal and influential. So we will actually be publishing a guide on this soon, the Political Economy Analysis Guide. So I do encourage any audience members who are interested to know more about that to keep an eye out for that coming out. All right, I'm going to move on now to the opportunities at this stage. And I think the opportunities really speak for themselves. We've said so many times already that if you can communicate biodiversity information effectively to decision makers, then your chances of them feeding that information into decision making is going to be so much better. So yeah, when you get it right, decision makers are able to visualize biodiversity in a clear way. So I think it's fair to assume that for many decision makers, particularly working in non-biodiversity related sectors, perhaps many of these, protected area or spatial biodiversity assessment concepts are very new and they're not familiar with them. But if you can kind of convey that information in a way where they're able to visualize it clearly, then you're, ultimately paving the way for success for that information to be used. It's also a chance to really gain buy-in from decision makers about the value of biodiversity. And it comes back to, hitting home that message and really clearly demonstrating why it's of interest to a range of sectors to use this information. It's also a chance, as I was saying, to identify good entry points for biodiversity information and policy planning, and political economy analysis, really just one example of tools that you can use to do that. And also it will foster collaboration between sectors to achieve common aims. And I think we had a session yesterday where we had different representatives from various sectors, and the resounding message from each of those speakers actually from the various sectors is that we need better collaboration. The interest in collaborating across sectors is very much there, but it's about kind of strengthening platforms and fostering kind of communities of practice to be able to do that. All right, if anyone else has any comments, do feel free to jump in now, otherwise I'll move on to the final stage of the data value chain. Okay, so the all-important end goal, using biodiversity information for national decision-making. So these have cropped up throughout the webinar already, but just to revisit some of the obstacles and gaps with this, there is always going to be competing cross-sectoral interests. So as I've said several times already, different sectors have their own commitments, goals, targets that they're trying to reach. And I'm sure many people who are working towards this aim of integrating biodiversity information into decision-making have often faced that barrier, that perhaps it just doesn't align with existing targets and goals in various sectors. Key government actors and national priorities are always changing. And again, this has come up, but I think it's such an important one. It kind of stresses the point that every single stage of this data value chain is something that needs to be constantly revisited in order to, make sure that any data being used is still reliable and current, but also to make sure that the whole data value chain has credibility, right up to the point where government actors are using the information for decision making. I'd love to know if anyone else on our panel has experienced any kind of major barriers at this stage. The use of biodiversity information in national decision making. I know certainly for the Connect project that it's still early days, and this is certainly the hope, but too early to say what the impact will be at this point. But if anybody else would like to reflect on any of their own experiences, I very much welcome you to do so.
I think for the OFD programme, one of the key elements has also been which governmental agency you engage with, as obviously maybe the governmental agency collating that biodiversity information and able to analyse it might not be the one implementing certain spatial planning decisions that would ultimately impact biodiversity. And so having the right ministries and the right agencies involved in the process right from the get-go so that they have buy-in and they feel they have a mandate to use the information is absolutely key, so that it doesn't stay restricted to the Biodiversity Agency or the Ministry of Environment, and instead also works with other sectoral ministries.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually, Sylvain. And having worked on other biodiversity mainstreaming projects within the centre myself, I know that certainly a really important factor to really securing buy-in from government decision makers is to, include them in the entire process. So that begins with assessing what demand they have for biodiversity information, and ultimately, as you know, stressing this process is taking place to meet your needs in terms of what information you need. So that's a really valuable point. Thank you very much. And we've got another one here that's just been added.
Kira?
Yes, please, Nadine. Nadine, I know you've had some connection issues.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I have. Sorry. I've only been getting about half of the audio, unfortunately. But one of the things in the Connect project has been that's been a key lesson for me is the fact that a lot of
It seems we've momentarily lost you, Nadine.
Decision makers, they want to do the right thing. It's just
Go for it. Go again. Hopefully we'll get it the second time around.
Nadine is typing in the chat, I think.
Okay, great. I think that's, yeah, the best solution here. I'll read it out for you. In fact, I'll invite Laura to read out your statement for me, if that's all right. And whilst Nadine is typing, I'm going to quickly address this other comment here, which is a really interesting and valuable point, actually. So thanks to whoever brought this to the fore. But what seems to be lacking in biodiversity mainstreaming is the notion of feedback loops within the value chain. So rather than kind of seeing it as simply a means to an end or a kind of one-time event, we need to see this more as a value cycle. So each process is kind of feeding into other elements of the biodiversity value chain. And it's an iterative, ongoing process. So I think this notion that it's a cycle rather than a chain is actually really important.
Kira, so Nadine's point is that having champions within different key sectors is crucial.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I understand where she's coming from with that. That's a great point. I think if you can kind of secure and pinpoint key stakeholders that you can build collaborative relationships with, this is certainly something I've experienced with biodiversity mainstreaming projects, is that having one champion who really understands the cause and communicate that to their colleagues in the ministries can do you huge favors in terms of, you know, achieving the ultimate goal of having that biodiversity information integrated into decisions. So I think that's a really fantastic consideration that anybody starting out on a project like this should take into account really early on. So thanks, Nadine, for that contribution. Okay, so I'm going to move down to the opportunities. Of course, the most obvious one is that all of this effort will have amalgamated in the use of biodiversity information in decision making. But there are some other important opportunities to highlight here as well. So it's a chance to not only get biodiversity information into national policies in the first place, but also a chance to measure and evaluate the impacts of feeding that information into national policies. It's also a chance to strengthen collaborations between science and policy. So I think these are very much, you know, two realms that have existed independently for a long time. And, you know, governments are kind of committing to more and more targets, and they're reliant on there being very reliable data in order to measure their progress towards those targets. And that's really where, you know, scientific research comes into play. You know, that's ultimately what we're reliant on to assess to what extent we can and will meet those targets. So I think that's a really important point here. And of course, it's a chance to establish communities of practice around the use of biodiversity information in policy. And I think at every point, at every stage of this data value chain, collaboration has been a really key word. And there are so many stakeholders and so many beneficiaries involved in this process. I think collaboration is really kind of word of the day, in my opinion, on the topic. So if anyone on the panel would like to kind of add any final points at all, then I welcome you to do so now. I'd like to say thanks to everyone already for your contributions to this. We've worked up quite a brainstorm throughout this session. And I'll stop sharing my screen now. All right, so that does bring us nicely to the end of the session almost, but I'd like to bring in each of our guest panelists to just kind of say a final few words about any of the points that really resonated with you from this session, or any kind of key learning outcomes and take-home messages. So I'll begin with Hilary, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, thank you. And I've just turned my video off because I'm having some network issues. But yeah, I'd like to thank you very much for today. And I suppose the take home for me, or what was really reinforced, is the collaboration and the openness that is needed with all of these actors in the value chain, and that it is not one organisation or initiative that is leading the others. This is really a kind of collective development effort in terms of not only at the data collection, but going right to the top of that chain and then back down again in terms of what we prioritise to fill, how we fund that. Yeah, that was my takeaway.
Thanks very much, Hilary, and a very good one at that. And I'll ask Sylvain next before moving on to Abisha.
Thank you. I think one of the key elements I will take away from today's session is the fact that there is a better and better understanding of the challenges along the biodiversity data value chain, and a whole range of actors involved who are facing similar challenges, and those have become a bit of an established fact. But it also means that all those actors are looking for solutions and are finding solutions to address those different challenges, and instead look at opportunities. And so I think a lot has changed over the past 5-10 years in terms of how we use biodiversity data, and a lot will change in the coming future. And we're certainly seeing more and more initiatives in ensuring that biodiversity data is involved in this decision-making processes. And it is certainly very ambitious, but also very promising in terms of how we are using that information for the future.
Thanks, Sylvain. Yeah, inspiring words there. And I certainly resonate also with those lessons. Abisha, do you have any final wrap-up comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, thanks, Kira. I think I can say a few things. Actually, the point that one of the participants, I think it's Ernest Lamptey from Ghana, raised, which I think is really critical, that decision makers, may not be interested, though very well informed, but they may not be interested in actually, acting upon the data that is available. I think the key really is to try to find sort of a creative ways of inspiring demand for biodiversity information in decision making processes. Why I say that is a key point, one of the key barriers actually to biodiversity mainstreaming stems from stakeholders' differing perceptions of the challenges and priorities for conservation, sustainable development, and so on and so forth. And politicians, of course, they deal with, and decision makers with the whole gamut of issues from, poverty, health, education, resilience-related issues, and so on. So I think the key is really to find creative ways on how you can actually make biodiversity information, how you can actually make them realize the importance of using biodiversity information, in decision making processes. Of course, they could be top-down approaches where you look at some of the key strategic national policy documents like national development plans or sector plans or national biodiversity strategy action plans to see where they could be, entry points for that. But I think it would be really nice if it's a truly demand-driven process where actually some of those ministries, let's say, the National Development Planning Commission or the Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Mining and Energy can actually reach out to agencies that are, do have this biodiversity data and information. If they could actually reach out proactively so that they can use that information, to influence their decision-making processes. So I think it's a very important point that I thought I should actually highlight.
Yeah, much appreciated, Abisha, for highlighting that point. I am totally glad that you brought that to our attention, because it is an important one. And from my perspective, I think I found it quite striking today. We're drawing on experiences from a kind of range of different stages of the biodiversity value chain, but also a range of different projects also. But we see the same obstacles, gaps, and opportunities cropping up throughout. And going back to what Sylvain was saying just now, this really is, a new frontier where obstacles are cropping up, but we're finding solutions, and we're building communities of practice around improving biodiversity mainstreaming. And I think the future is very bright on that front. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our audience for all of your participation. It's been wonderful. And a big thanks to our guest speakers, of course. And just a reminder also that we will be sharing the recordings to these sessions very shortly. So do go and check out the other sessions. Thanks also to our fantastic interpretation team who've been with us throughout. You've been wonderful. And on that note, I bring the session to an end. Thanks, everybody.